Hi, my name's Dan, and in this video we're going to go through the process of setting up SAML authentication within BookStack as the primary authentication mechanism. Right here I've got a pretty fresh BookStack instance. The only thing I've done is create a few bits of test content and enabled HTTPS for this instance. I'm going to be using Okta, a development instance, to provide as my identity provider for SAML authentication. So a lot of the detail, I'm going to show you the process of setting up the stuff from the SAML Okta side of things. But a lot of that detail might be different for your authentication system if you're not using Okta. So let's get started. I'm going to go through the Okta side of things first in terms of setting up the identity provider side. We'll create a new app integration. We'll go SAML2. BookStack SAML2 video. Of course, you'll probably want to call this something relevant to that'll be familiar to your users. I'm just going to call it that so I know the one for this video. The single sign-on URL, which is our ACS URL, we refer to the BookStack documentation. There is a section on identity provider configuration, and it says there the different URL endpoints. In this case, it's the ACS URL that we want here. And then before that, we need the BookStack base URL, which for me is that. That's our BookStack URL / SAML2 / ACS. Then our entity ID, which is pretty much the same, but instead of /ACS / metadata. Default relay state, I don't think we need that here. Name ID format, if you get the option, it's usually email address to work with BookStack. Application username, I think this is an Okta specific thing, so we're just going to leave that as username. And now the mapping of attributes. I'll show you how to use these within BookStack in a bit, but we're going to need to configure the details that we want going across the BookStack as part of the integration. So let's define a first name attribute, because I know that I've got that within Okta. Go last name as well. Have a nice and simple email attribute. Maps to the user's email. And then maybe just the ID attribute that goes to login. And now in Okta, we need to specify how we want the groups to go across, which we won't use initially, but we'll come on to that a bit later. I'm going to call this attribute groups. Plural. I'm going to say, I'm going to change this to regex and just say, basically match any group and bring those into this attribute. And then I'll just say I'm just an internal application, so I don't have to register this into their application database. Okay, so that is the setup that we need on the identity provider side done, at least for now. Let's configure this on BookStack. Again, we'll refer to the documentation. Within here, it's got all the relevant options to add to our env file. I'm going to copy all of these, then I'll paste this into my BookStack env file and we'll describe what each of these options does. So right now on the command line, I'm logged into my server and I'm at the location of my BookStack installation, bar www.bookstack. And I'm going to edit my .env file. I'm going to jump to the bottom of this file and I'll paste in all the options that I copied from the documentation. It will go up to the top. So to start off, auth method equals SAML2. This just activates SAML2 as our primary authentication method instead of the standard email address and password. SAML2 name, this is what is visually going to be shown to users as for this authentication option within the interface. So we could go Okta SAML2 maybe. And because we've got a space within this value, I'm just going to wrap this in quotes. We want to do the same if there's any other special characters, such as hashes as well. Just wrap it in quotes. And then the email attribute. So what attribute in the mapping do we want to use that's going to be the person's email address? So we've configured that. We go back to our Okta configuration, scroll down. I've configured that to an attribute called email. So I can just leave that as email. And similar for the external ID attribute. So what do we want to use as the person's unique identifier to store within BookStack? Again, I've called this just ID. I'll change this to ID. And then very similar with the display name attributes, although with this one you can define multiple. Because it might be the case that your provider doesn't provide like a full name. In my case, like Dan Brown, and might provide Dan and Brown separately under first name and last name, which is what we've got configured at the moment. First name and last name is not a full name within there. So with this option, what we can do is combine them with a pipe, such as that, last name. And this is all described up above in this section. But what that's going to do is going to take the first name attribute and then join that with the last name attribute with a space where the pipes are represented. You can do this with many more attributes if you need, not just two. Or you can just, if you have your display name provided a single attribute, you can just put the attribute name directly in there without the pipe, and that'll work fine. Moving on, the entity ID for the IDP, we'll remove this example value, and this is going to really depend on your identity provider. So for Okta, I'm going to go to sign on and view SAML setup instructions. And then they give that to me here. Copy this. Paste that in there. Now we can choose whether to auto-load metadata from our identity provider. So if you're able to go to the entity ID and you see the XML with all the data for your identity provider, then you can auto-load in the next few options. Just save some configuration and maybe save some management if those details change in the future. For me, though, with Okta, I don't think that's possible. I can't just go to this URL and view the data for the SAML2 Okta options. I'm going to leave that as false and we'll configure the next three manually. But keep in mind, you might be able to skip these next three options if you are auto-loading that in from the metadata. So this option, the IDP SSO, so the single sign-on URL, again, we'll remove that default, and that's provided by Okta here. Here we go. Now, similarly, the single logout URL. Now, unfortunately, I don't think currently Okta, the way that Okta does single logout, it does offer single logout as a service, but I don't think the way it operates works well or is compatible with how BookStack expects single logout to be done. So we're just going to comment that out for now. But if you did have a platform that supports single logout in a compatible way, it can be a bit finicky when it comes to single logout, how support works across different platforms. I believe we do support Active Directory with single logout, but you will need to have some certificates set up for that, which you'll see in the latter options. But in this case, I'm going to comment that out and we're not going to do single logout for the purposes of this demo. Then the certificate provided by our identity provider. So again, Okta provides us that here. We'll copy that. And we just paste that in there, and we're going to put in some quotes first. Quote mark, paste all that certificate data in there, and then finish it up with a quote mark as well. So yeah, just pasting in the certificate data in there. Now the auth context, generally you can just leave this as true. But if you have issues with the initial single login, it might be a case you need to change this in terms of how the authentication is performed. And then the service provider certificate. So defining these will sign outgoing requests from BookStack, the service provider, to the identity provider, in this case Okta, using a certificate and key that you might generate on the server side. This is especially needed, as I've just mentioned, in some cases where in single logout, like in Active Directory, I think they need to be signed. But in our case, we're not using single logout, and we don't need these requests to be signed. I'm going to comment these out. But again, if you did need these, it was very similar to the option above. You paste in the raw certificate data wrapped in quotes. So that's everything configured. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to jump back to our browser, and I'm going to go to one of my tabs here. So if I refresh the page right now, you can see we log in with Okta SAML2, which is the name that I configured within my env file for the login option. Click that, and I get this error because I forgot to assign the SAML authentication method in Okta. So bear with me, I'll just jump back into here, assignments, go to groups, assign to groups, and make sure everyone can use my SAML2 login. All right, let's try that again. Refresh, login within, and then we're in. So I was logged into Okta as Jenny Jenkins. So that's allowed us to go straight into BookStack, and it's created this user, Jenny Jenkins. If I have a look at my profile, I can see my name there, Jenny Jenkins. So that seems correct. It's my first and last name. Email address is jenny@bookstackapp.com. That's what I'd expect. So it looks like our details are coming across absolutely fine. Now, if our details weren't coming across, if we were missing things, or if we were getting error messages saying we were missing details, then there are options to help debug this within BookStack. So again, if we refer to documentation and go down, there's a debugging section, and one of the options provided is SAML2 dump user details. I'm going to copy that, and just as an example, show you what this looks like. And I'll put this within the .env file. And I'm going to change this to true, so SAML2 dump user details equals true. I'll jump back to our BookStack instance, I'll log out. Then when we log in with this option, instead of continuing on to BookStack, it will dump out all the details found to the browser. If we look at the raw data, there's a few sections in here. So one of them is the ATTRs from IDP. So this is showing the raw attributes that BookStack found from the SAML provider. So we can see our first name, last name, email address, and ID attributes in it, including our groups, which we're not using at the moment. So we can see exactly how things are coming across from our SAML system, and then the names of the attributes that they are under. And then we can see how BookStack is interpreting these into our user details. So how it's passed out our external ID, the name, email address, and again, our specific SAML ID. So if these look incorrect at all, if BookStack's not picking up the right attributes, then it might be a case that we haven't aligned those options that we configured to these attribute names. For example, if the email address wasn't coming across as we expect, and we had a look at this and this showed up as email_address, we'd probably want to go back to our env file, find the SAML2 email attribute, and then update that to email_address to match up. But in our case, everything's absolutely fine. I'm just going to go back to the bottom, use a hash in front of that option to comment that out, and save that so we can continue to log in. Attempt again, and then we're back in. So now login, it seems to be working okay. We're logged in as Jenny, one of our SAML accounts. So that looks to be functioning. But we haven't got admin access with Jenny. We can't go up to our settings. And it might appear that we've got no way to give ourselves admin access again. But we can restore that quite easily by just changing our authentication method back temporarily. So this is an easy way to get back into the system. What I'm going to do just on this other tab, I'm going to log out of the admin tab that I was logged in as. So we see the default login page. Then back in our env file, if we go back to that auth method option, as I mentioned earlier, we can just comment that out, save that, and then we will be back at standard email and password login. So we can use our old account, then get back in as an admin. So if we now have a look as the admin account, we'll go to our users list and have a look at Jenny. we'll look at her profile. And one thing to note is that some of these interfaces change depending on auth method. So we'll go back to our env file, uncomment this back to SAML2, save, go back to the browser and refresh the page. So we can change that and we'll remain logged in as our admin account, even though we use a different authentication system. But we can see this form has changed, this user form. We no longer see the password details because it's effectively redundant because we don't use a BookStack side password in the authentication flow. But we do have this external authentication ID field. So this represents the unique ID that BookStack uses to match up a BookStack user to a SAML provided user. So upon the authentication flow, upon first login of a SAML user, that SAML user will be provided to BookStack. It will see their external authentication ID. It will see that that doesn't exist within BookStack. So it'll say, okay, we need to create this person as a new user. It will create that person as a new user and store that authentication ID. The next time they log in, BookStack will then get that SAML user, see that authentication ID, scan the database, say, okay, we've already got someone with a matching external authentication ID. Let's match those up and log them in as this existing BookStack user. So it uses this value to match up a BookStack account to a SAML account. One scenario there, this can cause a bit of trouble, is if you have existing BookStack users when you try and configure SAML, especially where email addresses will already exist within BookStack, but also exist on users you might want to create via SAML flow, because email addresses have to be unique within BookStack. So if you already had, in this case, we already had a jenny@bookstackapp.com on the old authentication method, and we tried to log in, BookStack would go, it would find that user, it wouldn't see the matching external authentication ID within BookStack, so it will try and create Jenny, but because that email already exists, it will go, okay, there's already a user using this email address, but their external authentication ID doesn't match up. So we want to create them, but we can't because the emails are already taken. So BookStack will play it safe. It will go, something looks odd here because we've got a matching email address, but the authentication ID doesn't match up. Let's throw out an error, and then it will throw up an error and take you back to the login screen saying something along the lines of there already exists a user with this email address. So that can be a little bit problematic. And again, it's just done to be on the safer side, to not accidentally match people up with different accounts that they're not supposed to be connected to. What you can do in this scenario is, again, log in with a standard admin account, as we just did. And if you come to this field, you can just update this manually. So you could enter this Jenny@BookStack value in this case. So you put in the value that would be the UID provided by the SAML system. And then when they next log in, then BookStack can match that up using this value here and connect them to the right BookStack user account. So yeah, if you have a whole bunch of users, you can just go through them and update this field for each of those BookStack users. If you have a massive bunch, then that might obviously be quite problematic and take a while. So you could alternatively access the database directly. This is just like an external auth ID field on the users table within the database. Not ideal, so be careful if you're going to go down that route, but it is a potentially speedier way. Alternatively, you could use the BookStack API to update these values in bulk. But yeah, a couple of options if you need to do that in batch. But otherwise, if you want a fairly fresh system, it's going to be quite rare that you need to do that, or maybe just for your initial user if you've changed the email address of the default admin user account. So yeah, that's the external authentication ID field. Again, just good to be clear on exactly what that does, because that can be the center of any kind of matching up issues between users within the two systems. So now that we've covered the external authentication ID, let's talk about Jenny's roles. You can see that Jenny here has no roles at the moment, so she has no privileges. What can we do to give her some roles? So one option is that we could just do this manually. So she can just log in, and then we manually assign admin if needed or other roles, and it's just all manually done. But of course, that might not scale ideally or work to how you want to manage your BookStack instance. As quite a simple alternative, what we can do instead, if we go to the settings area, then go down to the registration section. There's a message here showing when SAML is active saying this has no effect the enable registration checkbox, because registration is kind of implicitly enabled, because we'll just create someone, but because we're looking up to the SAML system to know whether they're allowed in BookStack. It's not up to BookStack whether they should be registered or not. But this option down here is still active, the default user role after registration. So we can set that to, let's set that to an editor role. And we'll save that. But no, by default, this is for newly created users. If we go back to Jenny, we'll log her out and then we'll log back in. And we'll look at her via admin role. We can see she hasn't got that editor role applied to her because she was already in BookStack by the point that we configured that option. But if we delete Jenny, just as an example, and we'll log in again as Jenny. We'll go back to our admin account, refresh our users list, look at Jenny. We can see that she's now an editor because she's gone assigned that default registration role as her account was created as part of the automatic user creation system. So that can be quite a nice, simple way. If you just maybe need to assign someone like a least privileged role upon initial sign up by the SAML system, you can do that, assign them that, and then you can always then go in and manually edit roles as needed to provide more privileges upon what's default provided. So it's a nice, simple way to do things. I'm just going to go back and disable that. So for a more complex setup, there are options to map SAML groups to BookStack roles. So let's see what that looks like. Within our documentation, we've got a whole section on this. Now, I would recommend reading this text in details because it goes through the exact mapping logic, but we'll touch on that as I guide you through it. I'm going to copy these values like we did earlier. I'm going to go to the bottom of my env file again, and I'll paste these in. So the first one, SAML2 user to groups, that just changes whether this whole system is active or not, whether it does the mapping of SAML groups to BookStack roles. So we'll leave that as true, so we want to activate it. And if you want to disable it, you can set that to false or put a hash in front of it. Now the group attribute. So like the email and name attributes that we configured earlier, we just want to tell BookStack where we'll find the users' groups from their SAML response. As we saw earlier when we done that dump option, they're in that groups property. And that's what we have configured in our SAML system. So we go back to our settings, go down here, and we can see we've mapped this groups attribute to the groups that a user is in. And now SAML2 remove from groups. So this indicates whether BookStack should remove people from groups that they don't map to in the SAML system. So if we set this to false, which we'll do to start with, then BookStack will see what groups they match up to with what roles in BookStack, and they'll only add people to the matching roles. If we have this as true, then BookStack will start to remove people for roles that they don't match up to. Makes things a bit more dynamic and allows you to possibly have scenarios where you could remove them as an admin in your identity provider, and then upon next login, that user would be removed from being an admin within BookStack, as that will get taken away. Again, one thing to keep in mind with all this, with all the SAML kind of sync and how details go across, it all occurs upon login time. It doesn't occur in the background at all. So if we did have that scenario where we removed them from a group and we expected that to sync across to BookStack, or if we even deleted a user from our SAML system, then that won't change anything within BookStack until that person next tries to log in. So yeah, keep that in mind. If you're expecting things to be instant, they might not be. It can effectively last for the lifetime of their BookStack session. Cool, so we'll set this to false, so we don't expect them to be removed from groups. And then we'll save that. Now we'll just review some of the groups that we have going on. So we'll check out Jenny, and we can see within her groups, she's part of the Everyone, Editor, and Wizards groups. Now, if we have a look in our BookStack instance and have a look at our roles, we have Admin, Editor, Viewer, and Public. So by default, the role matching will simply use the role name and match that up to the group names provided by the SAML system. So between the two, at the moment, Editor is the only one that matches. And BookStack will do some normalization on these values, so it will lowercase and replace spaces with hyphens. Again, refer to the documentation for exactly how it does this logic, but we can see that those two exactly match. We've got editor to editor within BookStack. So let's test out to see if the system works. So before we begin, we'll go up to Jenny. She's already an editor, so what I'm going to do is just make her a viewer only. So Jenny is now just a viewer. If I go and to Jenny's tab, log out, and log back in, then we'll go back to my admin tab, click into Jenny, and we can see she's now an editor and a viewer. So it's mapped across the editor role, seen that she's part of that, and made her and assigned her to that editor role. But it hasn't removed her from viewer because she was already a part of that, and we didn't have that option changed. The remove from groups. If we change this to true, then we go through the same process. We'll log out Jenny, we'll log back in as Jenny, then we'll check her profile as our admin account. We can see now, because that viewer account isn't mapped to our SAML system in any way, it's removed her as a viewer, but it's kept editor because that one did map up. So we've got mapping going across. Something to note on the mapping is how that interacts with the registration role option that we saw earlier. So if we go to that option, it's currently set as none, but keep in mind that this will be used if you have sync enabled for groups to roles. So, and this is always used in addition to any ones that it matches up, even if you have removed from groups disabled or enabled. So we can say, let's have a default user role of viewer. And then again, we'll log out Jenny. I'll go back in. Then we'll check her profile. We can now see she's editor and viewer. So the sync has synced her up and assigned her the editor role because she's got a matching group. But although we have removed from groups true, and she wasn't matched to a viewer role, that registration role option has kicked in and also given her the viewer role. So a bit confusing, but it can allow you to kind of use a hybrid of the two options. You can have group syncing active with maybe a BookStack defined default where anything else fails. It allows kind of like almost like a backup option to be applied. Again, I'd maybe use the registration role as a least privileged account, and then allow role syncing to occur for any higher privileged accounts, such as like admin users. So that's kind of a simple scenario of syncing roles to groups. But it's kind of like a perfect world scenario where we have these names exactly matching. It might not always be that case. So if we go back and take a look at Jenny, as we saw earlier, she's part of the Wizards group. Now, this is something that a funky manager at the company maybe set up a while ago to represent admins, but now we can't change it because it's being used absolutely everywhere, and we've got stuff hard-coded to that name. But we don't want to have to create wizards within BookStack and have this account which we don't, it's kind of badly named. So what can we do in this case if we want to map up wizards to admin? Well, what we can do instead, if we don't want to do it matched on these names, there's this external authentication IDs box that we can use instead. If we put wizards in here, again, we can put that in lowercase because BookStack's going to normalize the names, lowercase and hyphenate instead of space. We'll put in wizards there. We'll save that. And just so we can see things in action again, we'll go to Jenny. I'm just going to remove the editor and just keep her as a viewer for now. So she's just viewer. We'll log out Jenny, log her back in. We'll view her account again. And we can now see she's also admin, editor, and viewer. So the editor group is just matched up on name from the SAML system to the BookStack role. The admin one has mapped up from the BookStack admin role to the SAML wizards group. And then the viewer account has come from our setting of the default registration role. So that shows the different mechanisms. If we go back and have a look where we define wizards, note this does say external authentication IDs. You can map multiple SAML groups to a single BookStack role if you wanted to. So it doesn't have to be a one-to-one relation. We can also maybe you can put like admins in there. It just needs to be comma separated. So you can get quite complex setups, and it works to match most use cases that you might have. So yeah, I think that covers all the different combinations of group syncing. Now we've gone through the setup via Okta, but as I said at the start, it can really depend on your IDP and the configuration options, and the different platforms are configured in very different ways and they have different options. So you may need to refer to alternate documentation, try and get it working with your specific identity provider. Otherwise, although not massive SAML pros, I have tested BookStack against various different SAML systems. So if you do have trouble, can try and maybe provide some support. Just drop into the BookStack Discord. We can try and get you on your way. Sometimes there's just incompatibilities in what identity platform support versus what BookStack supports. And there's just a whole lot of variety out there, especially when it comes to single logout. I think every SAML identity provider that I've tried works to the point of at least getting the core authentication working. It tends to be around single logout that you'll get any issues. Otherwise, yeah, as I said, feel free to jump into the Discord if you do have any trouble. But overall, I hope this video has helped you. And yeah, good luck with your own configuration.